Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given. Well, welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Karen W.
And this is Brenda J. And today we have Cathy Loerzel, co-author with Dan Allender of the amazing book, Redeeming Heartache, How Past Suffering Reveals Our True Calling. Cathy is co-founder of the Allender Center in Seattle. She has her MA in counseling, psychology, and is a respected leader, instructor, and speaker. Welcome to the show, Cathy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, we're very excited for you to be here. So I wanted to read this book ever since it came out. I knew by the title that it was my kind of book, just Redeeming Heartache. And, that I love the whole idea of it. So I got about 3/4 of the way through the book, but I purposely stopped as I knew I was going to go back to see my sister. And we were going to go back to my hometown, which was a big deal because it's been probably about 5 years since me and my sister had been back to my hometown. So I waited and I read the rest of it on the flight, my sister lives in northern Indiana. So when I flew into Indianapolis, I read the rest of it. And it was just such a great book to have in my head and to mull over the whole concepts of it when I knew I was going to be back there and just be bombarded with all these memories and definitely some heartaches. So it was just such a great book. And I talked to my sister about it so much when we were back there. And I just think it was really helpful to have all that information in my head and already be thinking about it. And I also signed up for a story workshop, which I'm excited about. I was hoping it would be this month because I'm so ready to tell my story, but it was full. So now I have to wait till April. But I said, if you have a cancellation, squeeze me in. But I'm very excited about that because I've been actually wanting to do that for a while. So I would just love it if you could share a little bit about your background and how you got involved in writing this book.
Yeah, so I started in 2004 quite on accident. I found my way somehow to this tiny graduate school in Seattle, Washington, and sat in orientation, had never heard of Dan Allender, had no idea what I was getting into. And all of a sudden I saw Dan get on stage at orientation. And again, it's a tiny grad school. And he started talking about life, about trauma, about abuse, about what happens in our lives and how we react to it. And it was as if someone was putting language to things I always knew in my body and in my heart, but had never been talked about before, especially in the church background that I'd come from. Mm-hmm. And so it was remarkable to hear. And I thought, okay, this is why I'm here. And I was his student first, but Dan is this crazy thing where he's brilliant, but he doesn't really actually know what he teaches or the sequencing of it. Yeah. And so I started to come beside him and start to make sense of what he was teaching and put it in order and start to link it together and really bring the methodology to his madness. And so he and I have been working together really in that way for the last 15, 16 years, and then started the Allender Center together because I found the work so compelling. And I saw that it was changing people's lives all over the place. And so my passion really became to document it, to concretize it, to bring order and really a different voice to the work, and then bring it to as many people who needed it. Yeah. So that's what I've been doing for the last 18 years.
That's great. I mean, just me.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Looking into it, I already want to do the certificate program. I'm like, because to me, it's like when I went through Mending the Soul. I don't know if you're familiar with Mending the Soul, but that's how Brenda and I met. It's a support group for anyone that's been through any kind of abuse. And once I went through the group myself, I'm like, okay, I'm signing up for facilitator training right away because I just knew this is, and it's kind of similar in the same way where you're just kind of connecting the dots. And to me, this whole idea of just seeing how God can redeem the things you've been through is just such a beautiful concept. And especially working with abuse. And we're always talking about that. So just seeing the redemption in that, it's just such a hopeful message. And that's what I love about it.
Yeah, this is so great that you're out there. Yeah. I didn't know about any of this stuff. And that's why we started the podcast. And the more we do it, the more resources we're finding for people, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's just fantastic. So you say in Redeeming Heartache that you have come to believe that it is through engagement of sorrow that God is known, and our purpose on earth is best understood.
Mhm.
Today, we write this book to invite you to explore your story with integrity rather than denial platitudes, to discover the stealthy means you have utilized to find your way back to Eden. Can you unpack that for us? What does it mean for us to have found our way back to Eden?
Sure. In my specific church background, I don't know if this is familiar to you, but the way I learned about Jesus was the idea that you're on one side, God's on the other, and the cross is the thing that goes between. And there was this sense that if you just believe in God, you can be healed and go straight across to the other side towards redemption. And what I kept on finding in my own journey was like, hey, that doesn't actually work. And when we believe it can work, it actually sends us into spirals of depression and anxiety because we feel like we're not doing it right, because we're still struggling with anxiety, depression, fear, eating disorders, addictions. Like we're still in the midst of these hidden secrets in our lives. And there was nothing in my church background that said, hey, God's actually found in the bottom, in the places of despair, in the places of heartache, in the places of a more honest understanding of where we're actually living day to day. It was this sense of if I'm experiencing those things, it's because I don't have enough faith. I don't believe in God enough. I need to do my devotions more. I need to go to church more. I need to pray more. I need to repent more, and none of that was working for me. And then I realized it wasn't working for most people that I was engaging with, if they were really honest. And so I think this book and the work that we do at the Allender Center is really an invitation to say, hey, God is found in the midst of you working through and being honest about your heartache, your suffering, where there's been pain. And that's actually where the face of God meets us, I think, is with us in our tears, with us in where we're most afraid. And I think that dipping down into those places that feel so dark and scary is actually the very essence of the power of God and the gospel.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely true. And then the more we name trauma, and we all know that we have trauma, and in your book you talk about there's the big T trauma and the little T traumas. Some things may seem insignificant, but sometimes it's those little things that happen that can be a bigger trauma, because it's what that told us, because in the book you talk about agreements and stories. And so the more compassion we can offer ourselves when we know about and understand our traumas, and we all have shattering, in what ways can our heartache be redeemed? I know that's kind of the overall theme of the book.
Well, I think we spend a lot of time and energy denying what is true about our heartache and pain. And the number one thing I get when I do story work, especially for people who have grown up kind of in the evangelical Christian church, is the idea of like, well, my parents did their best and I came from a good family and it must be my fault that I'm struggling because my parents were fine. Right.
Yeah.
And so what we do in the book is try to suss out, like, our brains don't know the difference between a big T trauma where there's like profound abuse, degradation of the body, violence. Our brains react the same to that as it does to when your mom is ignoring you because she's too busy, or you can read on her face that she's annoyed with you, or your dad is just kind of on the edge of rage all the time. So you can't name it as abuse, but your body is now in a cycle around understanding, like, I have to contain my dad's rage. I have to make sure I'm good. I have to make sure I don't trigger all of those small little things, because we're not talking about the idea of every large abuse is the thing that impacts us. We're talking about the difference between what we're meant for in Eden. We're meant for perfect connection with God, self, others, and the earth. That's what we're designed for in our bodies. And then we're flung into this earth and this world where we are not perfect. Our parents are sinners. We all struggle with lust and anger. All of us are kind of, look at the world. Like, it's stunningly beautiful. And we are beating the snot out of each other at every corner. And we can't help it. We are, and we're also creating beauty in ways that are incredibly stunning. Both are true simultaneously. And if you're not willing to look at both and understand both, you're either living in blind optimism where you're saying, well, everything is okay because we just need to have more faith. God is God. All things happen to the good of those who love him, all those platitudes. Or you're in blind cynicism where you're saying there's nothing beautiful. There's nothing good. All is broken. All is lost. And so, what's the point? And I think the redemption happens when we're able to hold those things together and weave them and then be able to really understand these things have impacted who I am and my way of relating to the world. And I need to deal with them, because if I don't deal, those things will just manage my life for me. And so if you have, a history with an angry, rage-filled father that you've never named as actual abuse, even if it's little abuse, then when you then go to raise your own kids and you're wondering why either you're avoiding, all emotion whatsoever, or you're triggered and unhinged at moments, or you feel like you're becoming your father, you're not going to understand why and how to actually manage your own heart in those moments if you don't understand what was happening back then that created your style of relating in the present. So they're all linked, but you can't do the work in the present without understanding the past.
Yeah, they go together.
Yeah, that's great.
They totally go together.
Wow. I didn't even think about the little traumas.
Yeah.
All adding up like that. So you say the 3 hallmarks of trauma are fragmentation, isolation, and dissociation. Can you break those down for us?
Yeah. So our brains are incredible at protecting us from trauma. And thank God, because as children, we know that we are in systems we don't have any power over, really. You can't get out of them. You can't really change them. And you also don't have the cognitive capacity in your brain to understand the more complex thinking, to understand the nuances of what's going on around you, right? So as children, we are left in these systems where we don't have language, we don't have an understanding of what's going on around us, and we can't, really understand, like when dad is coming home with rage, that he's actually really struggling with his own past trauma and sexual abuse that's never been dealt with. He's always on the edge of losing a job because, he's not functioning well. And he's also functioning alcoholic. Like as a child, you don't know that, right? And you can't understand that.
Right.
All you know is that dad's rage is awful and I want to keep it from happening. So I'm going to do everything I can in my little child body to keep it contained and figure out how to make it better. And children will often rewrite to say, it's my fault.
Right. Automatically. I think we automatically do that. Yeah. That's what's fascinating.
Right. Absolutely. And so when you're looking at that, let's stick with the rageful dad, even though, sorry to dads out there. At least we're not talking about moms. I feel like people talk about moms all the time.
Yeah. Let's focus on the dad for a change.
But in that moment, a child, when they're experiencing that sort of rage and violence, even if it's not profound, even if there's not physical abuse, that still impacts a child's psyche and their feeling of feeling safe and feeling known and feeling cared for. So what the body does is 3 things. The first thing is fragmentation. Fragmentation, basically, if your story is a puzzle, fragmentation throws the puzzle up in the air and puts all the pieces in different parts in your body and your mind so that you don't have to feel the weight of the whole. It's the body's way of saving you, because if you actually saw the whole as a child, it would be too much for you to bear and you don't have a way out.
Yeah.
And so your body automatically, and this happens as an adult too, when you experience fragmentation, think about the last 2 years of your life. Like look back to when COVID first hit and you were in isolation. Do you remember that season? Probably not.
Yeah. Bits and pieces.
Bits and pieces.
Yeah.
That's fragmentation. So your body is saying, okay, this is too much. I can't handle it, but I need to survive. I need to keep going. So I cannot bear the reality of all these things. And so we're going to push them all apart and keep them separate so that we can handle one piece at a time and keep moving, keep surviving. This is a survival tactic, right? Now, the healing part is that our brains, when they fragment, it's helpful in the moment. We need it to happen. But that means that there's a disintegration inside of our bodies and our minds. And then we'll be stuck with like, why am I so reactionary right now? Why is this bothering me so much? Well, it's because you see 2 or 3 pieces of the puzzle. All the other pieces of the puzzle haven't been put back together again for you to see the whole story, for you to say, oh, that's why. Yeah. Well, now my reactions make a lot of sense. No wonder why I don't trust. No wonder why I'm triggered. No wonder why I have an intense amount of anxiety. But you're not going to understand that if the whole picture isn't put back together. And reintegrating those fragmented pieces is actually really critical to healing trauma, because our bodies know the whole story. Our minds are the ones that have kept it all apart. So we're like, why am I waking up at 2 a.m.? in a little, stress ball, having to go down and watch 2 hours of TV or stroll through the internet or do whatever you do at 2 o'clock in the morning to calm yourself down. Like, you're not going to understand why your body is reacting that way unless you understand and you've put all the pieces of the story back together.
So is it just the traumatic events that become fragmented, or can be if you're in fight or flight for all those years, like I was? I feel like a lot of events, even good events, are fragmented for me.
Absolutely. Yes. It's not just the bad, it's the whole.
Okay. I'm noticing that. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's amazing, right? Because really it's your brain's way of creating adaptive behaviors so you can survive.
Wow.
Yeah. And so you'll look at pictures. Like, I don't know if you've done this before. You've looked back in old family, photographs. If you have more of a fragmented memory because you've had trauma, you go back and you're like, I don't remember that family vacation. I don't remember, those friends or often you'll have to go back and trigger some of those memories or recall them in order to be like, oh yeah. Or you start looking at your face in those pictures. I don't know if you've done that before, where you
don't recognize myself.
Yes. Isn't that wild?
Yes.
So that's the impact of fragmentation. Again, it is what is needed in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But now when you live in those fragmented states, it actually doesn't allow you to have deeper connections and understanding of the whole person of who you are. And it doesn't allow you to actually grieve what happened until those pieces are put back together and you can see the whole as an adult.
Yeah. And then like isolation, I mean, that's just basically feeling like you have to be apart from other people. That's another protective means to use. Yeah.
So fragmentation is one thing, then isolation is where you feel like, okay, people aren't safe. The world isn't safe. So I'm going to just pack it all in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be easier for me whether that's emotionally or physically, and both can happen in different areas of our lives. But it's kind of like that emotional elevator. That's like the part of you that's vulnerable, that wants connection. You realize it's too dangerous. You pack it all up, you send it down, and then you're like, that's it. And then if anyone else like calls the elevator back up again, you're like, I don't know about this. So you feel threatened. You feel unsure about how to trust. You feel, a sense of being really skeptical, suspicious of care. So isolation is a tough one because it's not just like, okay, I'm going to remove myself and go to my room. Yeah. It's how available is your heart to being connected and cared for by other people. And if you've had a history where that sort of care set you up for exploitation and harm and manipulation, that thing is going to be locked down. And it's going to take a lot of work to start to bring it back up. And that's work you have to do in your own body, but also then being around people who can care for you and love you in a way that helps you bring that up without demanding, right?
A safe way to do it.
Yeah.
And then disassociation, like what is...
Oh, man. Well, dissociation is such a huge piece of our daily life right now, and it's getting worse.
I think so.
Yeah. And what we needed to do as kids. And so, if you look back on your life, what happened to you when you were in those painful, difficult moments that were confusing? Oftentimes we found something to soothe us and distract us from what was going on around us. And so whether that's TV or reading or sports or school, or, we dedicate ourselves to something to keep us safe and distracted and numb from what's going on around us. Now, as an adult, that then puts us into behaviors of a lot of addiction, needing to self-medicate through alcohol, food, and workaholism. I mean, that's a huge one. Or even church, like I'll volunteer at the church. I'll become the person who's always, available and needed, right? So there are lots of ways that we can dissociate, but really it's just it's the space where what we're feeling is too much. We don't have the resources to be able to bear it or understand it. And so we distract and we numb and move away from it. Now, the healing of dissociation is to get to a place where you can slow down enough to start to feel what you're really feeling. Mm-hmm. And be able to start to have patience and name it and bear what feels unbearable. And so you'll be pushing up against places as a kid that you're saying, those feelings, I don't want to ever feel that again. So if you have, a history of stories of shame or humiliation or harm, you're going to have this sense in your body, like, I don't ever want to feel that again. And so if you ask me to get close to it, like the answer is no. Hard pass. Thank you. Thanks, but no thanks.
Painful.
It's painful. I don't want to do it. And that's so natural, but you have to in order to then be able to also move into those defragmenting states. So you have to be able to feel what you're feeling. And in some times that feels intolerable. That's why therapy is so helpful. Group work is so helpful. Good friendships, reading different books will help you become more connected to those feelings and realize, oh, this isn't going to kill me.
Yeah.
But in fact, how much I'm working to dissociate from it may.
Right. That's more unhealthy than dealing with the actual trauma or feeling those feelings. I find this all so fascinating.
Yeah. And the fragmentation. So you have to deal with the dissociation first, but how do you get those memories back from the fragmentation? Like I don't really understand how to do that.
Yeah. So this is what we spend this is what we spent our career doing at the Allender Center, is helping people do that very thing.
Wow. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, that's why I told you once. I just want to do everything now.
I'll be in I want to be getting the certificates too.
Okay. It's so interesting. So one of the quotes that you share after sharing Sally's story, which I could really relate to her story in the book, and it just really hit home with me. One of the quotes that you say is, "We often can't own the vows we've made to stay small, hide ourselves, and never stand out from the crowd." And so on this trip home, I really walked down memory lane. I mean, we literally walked by our old homes we grew up in, the schools we grew up in. And one of the things, I was talking with one of my old friends, and I was just saying, in high school, I just wanted to be invisible. Like I didn't do anything to stand out. I didn't strive to do. And that makes me sad now, because I look back and I'm like, I just wanted to cower. But I understand now a lot more now that I've done some work, as to why I felt that way. But can you share more about how we make vows when we've had these deep pains? Because I thought that was a fascinating concept too.
It is. And it doesn't take long, right? And so when we experience shame or moments where we think, oh, this doesn't feel good. I have so many stories of shame, and I might share some in the book. But there are so many moments where I would get invited to like a birthday party in 4th grade. And I would think like, okay, finally I'm in the in crowd and I get to go to this party. And I would like pick out a dress and, pack up my stuff and like get a new sleeping bag. This is the 80s. So it was like, those like, for any of you who grew up in the 80s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And spend hours thinking about the perfect present for this girl and get so excited. And I'd walk up with my little backpack and overnight bag and show up at the doorstep, only to realize the reason I was invited was so that I could be the butt of all the jokes, right? Mm-hmm. And so then immediately, as soon as I walked in, it's like they're making fun of my outfit or my sleeping bag or what I'm wearing or my hair. And the only reason I was invited in was to be the laughing stock, right? And so as a kid, when that happens, and that's, an awful story, it is a common story.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of us have those moments, right? Yeah. Yes. The heart of a child. Like, what do you do in that moment? For me, I was like, never again. I'm not going to trust. I will never be made the fool again. And so then I start to become hyper vigilant and like, I'm always watchful for where the other shoe is going to drop, where someone is actually like not honest about liking me or wanting to be my friend. Right. And so you start to ramp up these ways of protection. And a vow is just to say, I'm not going to feel this again. Therefore, I'm not going to do this again. Or, I won't trust. It's self-protection. Right. And it's so human. Mm-hmm. But what happens in a vow is that you're doing it to protect yourself. But then I think evil gets in there and says, yes.
Oh, yeah. Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we have a foothold to keep you, because now it's going to be a lot harder for you to have a relationship later or feel free and trust, delight, and play, right? Like after that, all of a sudden you're looking at your own body and saying, well, I can't trust, that my instinct around which outfit was cute anymore. So all of my own fashion sense, all of my own individuality went out the window. And then it was, whatever they're selling at the Gap is now the only thing that I'll wear, right? You do little things. Yeah. This is definitely aging me now, but those are the things that you do. And again, they're done to self-protect. But then the impact of that over time is really captivity. Mm-hmm. Because now you're bound, and you're bound to harm. You're bound to the harm that they did to you. And instead of actually grieving that and reconnecting with this little girl who is so earnest and sweet and excited, right? I look at her and I'm like, you fool. You fool. for trusting them. Like, how did you not see that coming? I blame her, not them. I blame her.
Yeah.
And that's the danger of the vow. And that's really what needs to be redeemed, is that sense of like, where are you holding yourself with such shame and contempt?
Yeah, there is a real sense of contempt in that. And I just see the enemy in all of that. Like, that's what I found really insightful too, is of course the enemy wants us to think, as Christians, have that horrible view of ourselves. And it just plays right into that.
It does. It does. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so helpful to then be able to go back to those places, because, it's not just about like figuring out all the places of pain and navel gazing, right? It's a sense of, no, these are places where you've been held in captivity and you've held yourself in contempt, and you are not going to be able to then move into the place that you're meant to be in the world and your calling to bring life and love and freedom and delight. Like, you're not going to be able to do any of that if you haven't addressed these past places that are still kind of cancerous spots in your body that need to be eradicated. They need to be cared for. And because they're, and that's with Sally's story, right? Like, there are these places in her story she was so beautiful and so full of life that she has then turned on herself on and said, that life cost me too much. So I will be small. I won't be seen. And now her very life force that she's created to bring to this world is now diminished. And that's what we're getting after, right? We want to be able to redeem those places where people's life forces have been sucked out of them. And now they're participating in it because they feel like they're self-protecting. So it's understanding what happened, but also what are you doing with yourself now that's keeping you there?
Yeah. And understanding why you did what you did in the past.
Right.
Such a key element too.
Yeah. I remember just thinking, I never understood why I did the things that I did. I drove my mother crazy as a teenager, and I never really understood why I did that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to have to really dig deep here. So you say, our stories can heal us if we read them well. Your true calling and ultimately God's glory can be revealed through your healing. That is such a hopeful message. So much like the book title. You and Dan Allender write how the Bible talks about the three main types of outsiders: the orphan, widow, and stranger, and how these can help us to identify the parts of ourselves that we each have to help define and heal our trauma. Can you share more about these roles?
Yeah. So, for me, this work is so much more powerful when I can think of it in terms of a character or a story. Because when we talk about things, especially in psychology, it could be so heady. And so what I love about this part of the book, and really this is the crux of the book, is looking at three core heart wounds. So when we realize the world's not safe and we get wounded and harmed, there are three main things that happen. We have the orphan wound, the stranger wound, and the widow wound. And, this is all very familiar to what we've been talking about in the podcast. So this will just be a continuation. But the orphan wound is really where you learn no one is coming. Your needs, what you really need from your parents, from the world to stay safe, to feel like you can play and rest. It's up to you to take care of yourself. And whatever you need outside of what you can take care of on your own isn't necessarily available to you. And so the orphan, again, becomes hypervigilant, suspicious of care, and is really just like marked by self-sufficiency. But that means that they're in a closed circuit. And so they're not open to delight or surprise or care outside of it because they're suspicious and they feel like that's just going to make them vulnerable to more harm. So if you think of the actual orphan, the archetype of an orphan no longer has the protection of parents. And so they're fending for themselves. And you can imagine that when an orphan gets to the place where they actually need something from someone else, they're going, shoot. That means I have to ask, I have to admit my need. And it also means that when someone gives you something that you can't give yourself, you often feel like, okay, what is this going to cost me? Right. And so think about in your own lives, like when you receive something, a sweet gift from someone else, or someone shows up in a time of need that you weren't expecting. For an orphan wound, one of the first things, and often we don't want to admit this, is we think, oh, this is so great. Shoot, now I owe them something. I have to make sure that I repay that because I don't want to be in debt to someone else because that puts me in a vulnerable position. So we're constantly figuring out like the balance of, okay, so if I've sat and had an amazing conversation with a friend and they've cared for my heart. And it's been so good and so rich. And I feel so loved. Immediately, I'm like, oh, I talked about myself too much. Next time we meet, I need to make sure that we spend a lot of time talking about them, because I don't want to feel like I'm taking up too much and then they're going to be resentful for my need, right? So I want to make sure I balance it out. And so the orphan is always looking for like that balance act. And that can be subtle or that can be extreme. So that's the orphan. The stranger is where we've learned that whatever we're seeing in the world, or a stranger is really the one who is so attuned to what should be and could be in the world, but has been rendered powerless to do anything about it. So your strangers are the ones who just become disillusioned and angry and rebellious because they realize, like, I don't fit. No one else is seeing the world the way that I see it. No one is realizing that something has to be done. So this is the kid who going to church on a Sunday morning, they're in the back seat of the minivan, again, 80s, although minivans are still in the back, and they know their parents have been in this huge fight all morning the day before, and their dad has been screaming at their mom, and their mom has been, and they're going back and forth, and it's ugly and awful. But they know that when they get out of that car on Sunday morning, they're supposed to put on a happy face, and their mom is going to sing up front. Their dad's a deacon who's going to take the offering, and they just need to like kind of pull it together and pretend like everything's fine. Yeah. Well, the stranger is the one who's going, nope, not going to do it. I'm not playing this game. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to pretend on your behalf. And so what happens for the stranger is that they get pushed out of the family system or named bad, or like, why can't you just be like your sister who, goes along with everything? Why do you have to be so dramatic? Why are you feeling all those feelings? Like, can't you just pull it together? Can't you just be quiet? Can't you just follow the rules? Can't you just do what everyone else does? And the stranger realizes, like, well, screw you. I don't know. But they also then get relegated outside the city gates. Like, they don't belong anymore. There's no place for them. And so they feel isolated. They feel alone. They feel rebellious. They feel a stranger in the world. And for the stranger's heart can really shut down around that, because really what they have is a lot of longing and desire for authenticity and beauty and goodness. These are your artists and musicians and really the prophets of the world who see the way that things should be, but they stay in that stranger heart, right? They're just going to be the people who are always throwing stones or always just outside instead of actually coming back in and having to realize you're heartbroken because of the way the world is. And you actually deeply desire to belong, but you've never been able to find a way in.
I like the authenticity.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the stranger. And the widow wound is the sense of you've known love, you've known connection, and now you understand that death is inevitable. And so the widow is now forced into a world where, a lot of the widow wound for a child will come through divorce or abuse by a loved one. Where they've trusted, they've given their heart over, they felt delight and goodness between them and another person. And then they realize, like, oh, this is actually abusive, or, my parents got divorced and now I'm left alone. And the core battle for a widow is the idea of, now that I know that you love deeply, you give your heart over, and then death is coming, I won't love again. That's the core vow of the widow. I'm not going to give my heart over. I'm not going to love again that deeply. I won't give and receive. We're not going to do that anymore, because now I know that death is coming. And even if it's an existential death or a real death or the death of a relationship or the death of the type of relationship, this can happen a lot, where some parents get along better with their kids when they're younger because they love them and they feel like excited about who they, like they're sweet little kids. And then they grow up and become more complex, and the parents will kind of turn their back on the kids. So that widow wound can be within those stories where a child is like, I thought I was loved, and now I can see on my mom's face that she's annoyed with me and just wants me to go back to being 5. She doesn't want to deal with my complex emotions. And so there's that sense of like, I'm going to shut this all down. And
well, they definitely are a lot easier when they're younger. Mine are grown up now. It is very complex.
It is. Yeah. It is. And it's understandable to see why that happens, right? But then it's also as children, we have to see how that impacts us, and adults, we have to then be able to recognize where we need to go back in and repair when we can say, this has been tough.
Yeah. And we can be a combination. I mean, because that's one thing I struggled with when I was reading the book. I don't know which one I am. I mean, we can have a combination of all of them, right?
Okay.
Yeah. It's not like we're one, well, I'm the stranger. We have to identify with, because we have little bits and pieces of all that in us, right?
We do. Yeah. The point of the book is to say, look, Jesus suffered all three.
Yeah.
He was the ultimate orphan, the ultimate stranger, and the ultimate widow. And what we see in scripture is that it also says that those are the least of these that we need to care for. And so what we're looking at is the least of these in our own spirits that need tending to and care and love and healing. And ultimately, that's what Jesus brought us in his presence, and the sense that as those parts of us are healed, it actually brings us into a wholeness that we don't even understand is available to us until we start to heal these different parts of these different wounds in our lives.
That's good. That's good stuff.
Yeah. And you see, Jesus was very compassionate to the stranger and the widow and all that. So that makes sense. So another quote from your book, you say, as I've spent the past 16 years working with people's stories, I am more convinced than ever that healing is not about waking the chasm of suffering or grief, but about finding the faith to believe that we can sink into sorrow, plunge into the abyss, reckon with what's true, and find God there, weeping with us. That's kind of like what we're talking about. It's only there that we will find freedom, play, gratitude, and joy. And I definitely related to that part of it. So, but I know in some Christian circles, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, it's looked down on to look back or even to apply psychology to your pain. And I remember, and this was years and years ago, but I remember being reprimanded by a pastor's wife, and I brought up a book that referenced, I think it was called the book Healing for Damaged Emotions or something like that. So, so why do you think this approach, the church looks down so much on this has this approach?
Well,
that's I know. It's a big question.
What pile do I want to step in? I think ultimately it's
to be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2 of Redeeming Heartache. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.